Awesome. Good to hear. All right. Well, welcome everybody to this evening of storytelling. I'm not going to go too much into technicalities of research or anything tonight because it's a Thursday evening, and I just invite you to sit back and relax and learn about this place that's very special to me and to think about places that are important to you. The core of this presentation is about talking about how strong connections to place can foster stewardship and increase our ability as individuals and communities and governments to really protect what we care about in the face of the growing multitude of pressures that are facing nature these days. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the story of the ocean and the communities in Howe Sound Átl'Ka7tsem. Átl'Ka7tsem is one of the 3 Squamish Nation place names for this region, which is located on their ancestral and unceded territory and overlaps with the territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Sechelt, and Lil'wat nations as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the learnings I've had through working with the Squamish Nation over the past few years with some of this research work. But my goal is essentially for you to walk away from this talk with a really clear sense of hope and optimism and commitment to strengthening your connection to place so that you can go forward and be strong stewards in order to protect the nature that surrounds you. Okay. So before going too much into this place, into this map, in this region, I'll talk a little bit about my, my personal journey and who I am. So I grew up in Vancouver, but I was privileged enough as a child to get to spend a lot of my summers in my childhood exploring the shorelines, the rocky shorelines of Bowen Island. Livelihoods is the Squamish Nation name for this island. And so that exposed me to nature from a young age and really did sow the seed of connecting to place and being inspired by the ocean and BC's coastal ecosystems. And that led me to pursue a degree in biology and history at McGill University as my undergraduate degree. But while I was out east, I really missed Vancouver and I really missed Howe Sound. So I came back home after graduating and I started working with OceanWise's Research Institute, which Joan mentioned. And I was very lucky to get to work back in this place where I grew up. Not very many people get to do that. And I feel very grateful to have gotten that opportunity and to continue to do that. This was also the time in my life when I began to get to know the people who lived in this region and understand what the human communities are like here. And a couple of years later, I started school at UBC in the Zoology department, where I'm, as Joan mentioned, pursuing a PhD in understanding how climate change is impacting BC's coastal ecosystems. So I'm really just overall very enthusiastic and appreciative of getting to live and learn and work in this place that is so wonderful that, that I'll share with you today. Before zooming too far into Howe Sound, though, I want us to zoom out a little bit and remember where we are. I don't know where all of you are joining from, but I assume that you're probably somewhere in the Lower Mainland, maybe Howe Sound, but maybe elsewhere. So this is a map of Howe Sound, which is in red here. It's this deep water fjord that was carved out by glaciers. It's one of the southernmost fjords along British Columbia's very jagged coastline. And it's almost smack dab in the middle of the Salish Sea, which is the inland body of water that crosses the Canada-US border and is located between the mainland and Vancouver Island here. We have all of the watersheds that flow into the Salish Sea outlined in blue on this map. So what's the most important thing to grasp when we look at this map and we think about the ocean is to acknowledge and realize that life in the water is so connected, right? The water flows across jurisdictional boundaries, it flows across all sorts of human activities, and salmon that swim out from the Squamish River go through the Strait of Georgia, cross into the Juan de Fuca Strait, maybe into Puget Sound, and then out into the Northern Pacific Ocean. So it's this incredibly dynamic and connected zone, and for us who work in this arena, especially for people who are working on planning or conservation, we need to remember that and ensure that we're being as collaborative and as inclusive as possible in our work. So now zooming back into this fjord. This is a picture taken from Squamish at the mouth of Howe Sound, looking down on a cloudy and looks like snowy or rainy day. Átl'Ka7tsem, as I mentioned, is one of the Squamish Nation place names for this region, and it refers to traveling out from Squamish into the Strait of Georgia, because traditionally the nation used Howe Sound as a transportation route, as their main highway to connect from villages up in the Squamish Valley to those that are dotted throughout the Sound and down in Vancouver. They have another word for traveling up the Sound to the Squamish villages, and another word for the western portion of the Sound. I've been really lucky over the past few years to get to work with nation members and to build and develop relationships with them and learn from them. And I'm very grateful for that, because Indigenous cultures and peoples have a different way of connecting with natural systems than Western or settler societies do. So I thought I'd share one of the teachings that I learned a couple years ago when working with some of the youth in the nation. We were having a workshop and we were talking about the plants and animals in the Sound. And settler society sometimes likes to refer to these as resources, trees, resources, fish, resource management. They're species that we want to manage and control so that we can sustain the benefits that they provide to humans, ecosystem benefits sometimes, and services. But Johnny, one of the youth who I work with, said, no, we don't really think of these as resources, they're life. Their relatives. And just that subtle word change can carry a huge impact in how I now think of the plants and animals that I work with. And I think that's a really important teaching, to try to go about work in a more relational sense that takes down the ego of man and human, and just kind of puts us on a more even playing field with the rest of the life that we're working with and that we're interacting with. So that we can be more reciprocal and respectful in our interactions. So that's just something that I thought I would share with you that I learned from the Squamish Nation members. So Howe Sound, Átl'Ka7tsem. Currently, if you go and visit this region, I'm sure you'll be just astounded with the natural beauty and with the incredible vitality. This region is thrumming with life and with culture, ecological richness. There's a ton of activities out on the water, so much marine recreation, lots of marine activities happening, and a ton of positivity and enthusiasm. But it was not always this way. And in fact, for those who have lived in the Sound or visited it for several decades, you'll remember a time when this region was kind of an ecological dead zone. It was very heavily contaminated by several industrial activities, most notably the Britannia copper mine, which operated from 1904 to 1974. And this mine was responsible for leaching a bunch of acidic effluent into the water, which degraded the water quality such that there was really not that much marine life to be found. Other industrial activities included several pulp and paper mills, which were also leaching effluents, dioxins, and furans into the water. And then kind of the cumulative impact of those with log booming along the nearshore and a chemical plant up in Squamish, and just we were doing things that had a big impact and we just weren't doing anything about that. So people refer to this area or referred to it as, dead zone. It didn't smell great, didn't seem great. It wasn't thought of as a gem that it is now. But thankfully, over the past several decades, a lot of this industry has proactively taken steps to repair the negative footprint that it has had. So the Britannia copper mine no longer operates, and they installed a water treatment plant that has effectively cleaned up a lot of the water that's still draining into the Sound from the Britannia Valley. And then some of the pulp and paper mills closed down. Others, such as Howe Sound Pulp and Paper, put in a water treatment plant as well. So we're seeing really positive steps taken by these sectors, and that's resulted in the Great Recovery, but there's a question mark there. So I feel really lucky because over the last 5 or so years that I've been working in the Sound, it's been during this recovery period and this revitalization period, essentially for the past several decades, or for the past decade or so, we've started to see the return of these big charismatic marine mammals. Orca, Pacific white-sided dolphin, humpback whales, they're all returning to the Sound. And some people who I work with who live in West Howe Sound even say it's like clockwork, that in the summer, they know exactly when the orca, the transient orca, are going to be coming along their route between Gambier and the mainland. And that's super cool that they're returning, and also that they're so visible, because that really inspires the community then to kind of remember that this is a beautiful and vibrant marine ecosystem that has a lot of potential for growth and recovery. Also, what's nice about the marine mammals is we know that they're at the top of the food chain, right? So this beautiful graphic is from the 2017 Howe Sound Ocean Watch report, which is a report produced by OceanWise's Research Institute, and I have a link to it at the end of this presentation. You can see that the marine mammals are up here. So when they return, it signifies that the food that they eat and the food that they eats are probably returning as well. In this case, I want to draw our attention to forage fish, which are another really cool and positive story in the Sound. Over the past few years, we've seen the return of herring to spawn in lots of different areas around the Sound. And at the beginning of this call, folks were talking about Indigenous harvesting methods for herring roe. So the Squamish Nation does a similar thing where they drop in hemlock boughs and then the herring will lay the eggs on the hemlock boughs. And then they can take the boughs out without having to kill the fish. So it's a pretty sustainable fishery. And they were able to have a traditional harvest for the first time in a really long time, 2 years ago. So that's really exciting. And then these beautiful fish down here are northern anchovy, who have started to come into the Sound. And I think this is maybe a northern range expansion. I don't know whether they were seen here before, but these fish are inspiring like crazy feeding frenzies of sea lions and seals and marine birds and eagles and all sorts of animals. So that's really exciting. But there's a but. So we've seen this like demise because of industrial activities and then industrial actions to improve their footprint and slight recovery. And we're entering into this new era where there's a burgeoning new suite of pressures. And this photo kind of hints at what those can be. Essentially, Howe Sound is right next to Metro Vancouver, this growing metropolis, the most dense part of our province, populated part of our province. And we're seeing this spillover effect. So the Sound is now getting a ton of visitors to the parks and to the water, and more people are moving here to live. So again, graphics from the 2017 Ocean Watch report. This map on our left shows the population growth between 2006 and 2011. And you can see that Squamish grew a ton during that time period. In fact, it was one of the fastest growing municipalities in the country. And growth is good because people can then expose themselves to this region and start to love it and care for it, but it can also present a lot more cumulative effects, such as increased wildlife encounters, increased pollution, increased transportation and carbon emissions, increased habitat conversion with development. So there's all of these added pressures now that we have to be aware of and thinking about that the cumulative and the layered impacts of those effects of urbanization and overvisitation. And then looming in the dark and increasingly present in part of our summers and winters is the effects of climate change. So I have this short photo series that kind of really strikes me, at least, in how I've been experiencing climate change over the past few years. This is a photo that I took on a boat in the middle of the Sound in August of 2019. And it's looking north towards Anvil Island and up the Sound into this, up here is Squamish. This is a photo taken exactly 1 year previous in pretty much the same spot, looking towards the mainland, and you can barely see the mainland. This is the ferry over to Bowen Island. The air is dense with forest fire smoke, and this was one of the first experiences that I'd had of just like the significant effects of climate change. This is another photo that I took this past fall in September, when we had, again, those couple of weeks where we had that really intense spell of forest fire smoke from all of the forest fires and wildfires in California and Oregon and Washington and BC probably. And this is taking a boat from Bowen Island over to Gibsons. So yeah, the effects of climate change are happening now, and they're only going to continue to grow. And if I can just kind of draw the analogy between what this felt like to be breathing in smoke and what a lot of marine invertebrates are experiencing as the water around them, similar to the air around us, is changing. It's becoming more corrosive due to ocean acidification, it's warming up, and it's altogether becoming a much more stressful place to live. So all of the effects of climate change are gradually impairing the ability for a lot of these organisms to grow and survive and flourish in the way that they would like to. So I kind of went through a little bit of that, like that industrial, and then we have the recovery, and there's some species that are doing really well, but there's some species that are still quite vulnerable and not doing so well in the sound. And I really want to make sure that that comes forward, because I'm an optimist, so I tend to get like really excited about the good stuff, but there's a lot of work to be done still. So in terms of fish species, we have rockfish here, this quillback rockfish, and then lingcod. And these animals are protected in the sound by a fisheries closure. So you're not allowed to fish them anywhere in the sound because their abundance is so low relative to elsewhere on the coast, and it's not improving. So Oceanwise has been monitoring these two species for a long time now, and we're not seeing a recovery in the number of fish in the region. And there's also anecdotal evidence of several populations being poached. So that's not great. We need to do more work to protect these fish, especially rockfish, which can be longer lived organisms that reproduce at a late stage in life and they stay in one place, they're faithful to their home, so they're easy to overfish. We also have marine birds here, and I would point you again towards the Ocean Watch report for species-specific chapters on all of these animals in the sound to see what their current status is. But there's several marine species of birds that are declining and that we need to ensure we continue to provide habitat and food for. And then, of course, we have our beautiful glass sponge reefs, which are an incredibly unique and iconic species that lives in the sound. And I'll touch on them a little bit more later in the presentation, but they're quite fragile and they are vulnerable to climate change and to fragmentation due to any sort of physical impacts or disturbance. If it's fishing gear or if it's people bumping them when they're diving, they can break quite easily. So all this to say, it's complex. There's some things that are doing well and some things that we need to put attention toward. So what are we going to do about this then? What I've been working on over the last few years is understanding how we can protect the health of our ocean and our communities, because they're deeply intertwined. As a marine conservationist, I'm inspired by the ocean, but I know that in order to protect the ocean, we have to be working with people, because people are the ones who are causing these negative changes to happen. And one of the ways that we can do that is to work very hard to ensure that we connect knowledge and research to action. So as a researcher, I don't want to just be doing a survey and putting it out there and expecting that someone will do something with it. I need to take responsibility for translating that research into policy or education or anything else that I can to make sure that it actually effectively protects these animals and plants. So I'm going to walk through a couple case studies of really good examples of effective connection of knowledge to action in Howe Sound at Átl'Ka7tsem. And for those who are immersed in this area, these might be familiar with you, but for those who aren't, I hope that they're inspiring and they provide a source or a guide for what can happen in other regions as well. So I've mentioned it a couple times now, but in 2017, Oceanwise, the Vancouver Aquarium, published a report called the Ocean Watch Report, which pulled together information about what we knew about several species and human activities in the area, and sort of just provided that summary, that snapshot of how well they're doing. But in addition to providing that research, they also put together an action plan. Just gonna, siren going by me. An action plan for local governments to do something with the knowledge of which species are doing well and not doing well. And this action plan inspired elected officials in the region to come together and meet on a monthly basis for a year and a half to talk about how they were going to bring these forward. And it really started to kind of make decision makers in this region think and work collectively to think of the whole rather than just like their fragmented local government jurisdictions. And the first action in this action plan was to create a marine guide that brings together information about the area into a unified spatial decision support tool, which is the Marine Reference Guide. And this is one of the projects that Joan mentioned at the beginning that I'm involved in. So the Howe Sound at Átl'Ka7tsem Marine Reference Guide's goal is to pull together spatial data and create decision support tools that will inform marine spatial planning and community education in the region, all with the intent of building our capacity to protect and restore and be stewards of the diverse natural and human values associated with the Sound's water. So when I say natural and human values, I'm essentially meaning that we want to make sure this tool contains ecological data, but also socioeconomic data and cultural data, so that it's really getting at that more holistic and integrated resource tool. And the Marine Reference Guide, we try to achieve this goal through 3 main activities. First of all, we create research and decision support tools like these maps. The second way that we do it is to conduct community engagement events and workshops so that we kind of inspire people to connect to this place and really grow that sense of responsibility for protecting key values here. And then our third activity is to build relationships across communities, because any ocean planning and conservation and management does require people to work across the table with other groups and other stakeholders and other communities. And so we really try to strive for that roundtable collaborative dynamic. So I'm going to go through a few of the research activities we've done. As I mentioned, a lot of our work involves maps. So we've created this online interactive map that I'll show you a little video of. But the reason why maps are really important, especially for the ocean, is because for the vast majority of us, when you look out on the ocean, we don't really understand what's going on below it because we can't see it. So it can be out of sight and out of mind. And that's what's led to a lot of damaging behavior, such as overfishing, because we can't see when we fished the last fish, and pollution, because when you drop something in the ocean, it just vanishes. And so maps are at least one step that we can take to visualize what's there, what's important, and what damaging activities are happening. And when I say interactive map, it means that it's a map online that you as an individual can turn on and off data layers and overlap them to see how they work. So I'll give you a little bit of a demonstration right now of what that means. Can you see this video okay? That's it. I hope so. So this is our online interactive map. And right now I'm opening up the data layers. So we have different categories here, ecology and human use. And I'll click on the Eelgrass data layer because this is one that I'll mention later on in the presentation. So you can see the pink distribution of eelgrass go on and off. And that control is one of the neat features of this map. So if we go now into a human use category, you can check out, we have over 300 data layers in this map right now. So I just sort of arbitrarily clicked on a few, crown tenures and pollution. And you can see what all of those colors mean if you just click for the legend. And yes, there's a ton of data, and you can sort of like zoom into the areas that you care about, or you can zoom out and look at more broad data layers. This one came from the province's cumulative effects assessment for the terrestrial component of this study area. And yeah, it's just kind of a nice way to have it all together in one place. We also have these reports where we have the non-spatial data layers, and you can click to go to websites like the Ocean Watch report, or just to read through any sort of environmental consulting reports that have been done in this area. So that's kind of an overview of the tool, and it's going to be launched publicly in June, but there's an existing interactive map that's publicly available already that's more conservation oriented, called Howe Sound conservation.ca. I have that link at the end of the presentation as well. So if you're super keen after this presentation and you just want to go and explore it, that's the one to go to. I mentioned glass sponge reefs. So now I'm going to kind of just talk through this story, because this is a really positive conservation story associated with this region. And several people on the call played a huge role in the story. So glass sponge reefs are these beautiful structures that are essentially like the coral reefs of BC, because we don't have coral reefs, but these sponges do a really similar thing where they grow on top of each other and they create habitat that's complex and that tons of life form uses. So we have invertebrates that use it, like prawns, and little like squat lobsters, and fish use it as habitat. They're also just beautiful. So there are these stunning white features underwater. In Howe Sound, they grow quite deep, but Howe Sound is also the only place in the world where they grow shallow enough that you can scuba dive to access them, which means that it's a really great place for research and for learning more about these species. BC's coast is the only place in the whole world where these sponges have been found, and they've sort of been rediscovered. We thought that this species went extinct like back in the dinosaur era. So it's really neat that they've been rediscovered and that they're alive and thriving. Also, the neat part of their discovery is that it was largely citizen science led. So it was divers in the area who discovered these reefs, and then they worked really hard to survey them and to map out the distribution, then to present that data to DFO, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and work with them over several years to achieve the conservation designation that have been announced over the past few years, which I'll show you now. So in the map, what you can do is when you open the data layers, you go to ecology and then invertebrates, and you can find the glass sponge reef data layer. When you click it, you'll see the sponge reefs that have already been ground truthed, and you can open up the marine refuge boundaries, which are kind of just, it's a buffer, there's a buffer between the actual reef and the boundary to protect them. And yeah, they're just a fantastic species in the Sound. Just for fun here, I also clicked on a few other invertebrates so that you can explore a little bit more of the marine life, and showing the feature that when you click any data on the map, all of the data about that data pops up so you can learn about, who collected it, when it was collected, a little bit more. This is cetacean sighting, so all of the marine mammals. And if you click that, you'll see it was a killer whale, spotted in 2018, and then you can go to the website where that data was collected. These videos I know are pretty quick, so I was more showing them as like a little teaser, so you can get a sense of what the power of these maps is. But yeah, as I mentioned, several of the reefs have already been protected along the eastern portion of the Sound, and over the last year or so, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has been ground truthing additional reefs in the Sound in order to protect those ones as well, and to designate them as marine refuges, which are fisheries closures and areas where you're not allowed to drop any fishing gear so that we don't damage the reefs. It's a really positive conservation story, and something that really demonstrates the power of communities and individuals in affecting change in order to protect nature and these beautiful species. So just another little overview on the Marine Reference Guide and some of the other work that we're doing. As I mentioned, we work a lot with the Squamish Nation, and several youth from the nation have been championing some initiatives to engage Indigenous youth in the stewardship in this region, and to talk about Indigenous-led stewardship programs like Guardian programs. So we're really excited to be working on that, and also on some place name work and bringing in the Squamish language into our mapping process. Because traditionally a lot of mapping work has been quite colonial and has been used to fulfill goals like land and resource acquisition, and taking land away from Indigenous nations, and any sort of learning about their resources and then going in and extracting them. So there's a lot of harm that's been caused by mapping work and by settler research. So we want to make sure that our project does not continue to perpetuate that harm, and that we ensure we have a respectful relationship with the nations on whose lands we are living and working. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and start talking about one particular marine species that's really captivated my attention over the past few years, which is eelgrass. So this is a nice little video of our native eelgrass species, Zostera marina, taken in Howe Sound by Bob Turner. And yeah, I didn't know about this species until I moved back to Vancouver after undergrad and started working with Oceanwise. And that's when I kind of learned, oh, what's eelgrass? Okay. And the more that I learned, the more I was fascinated by this plant and just totally fell in love with it, because it's so important to our coastal ecosystems, and it performs so many functions and provides so much value to humans and to marine life. So a healthy eelgrass meadow is when the eelgrass shoots grow in a really dense and connected meadow, and they kind of provide this nice 3D and complex habitat for underwater life. A lot of the seafloor in the Sound, because it's a fjord, is just very steep cliffs and rocky cliffs. So you see the cliffs above land, they just continue down below the water surface. But there's a few areas where we have a little bit shallower seafloor. It's often quite rocky, but when it is softer sediment, that's where you'll see the eelgrass grow. And eelgrass it provides little plants grow on the blades, and then invertebrates like snails and crustaceans, they'll eat those epiphytes that grow on the seagrass blades, and then fish will eat the invertebrates and birds will eat the fish. So there's been over 400 species documented to make use of 1 meter squared of eelgrass in the Salish Sea, which is incredible. They're foundation species in that regard. But in addition to their ecological function, seagrasses and a few other marine plants, such as mangroves and salt marshes, perform an incredibly valuable function when we think of climate change. They sequester carbon and they trap it in the sediments that they're growing in. And this is called blue carbon. So blue carbon is the term used to refer to any carbon dioxide that's trapped and stored in the ocean, as opposed to on land in forests and grasslands. And eelgrass are responsible for capturing and sequestering 10% of oceanic carbon, which is really incredible. Salt marshes and mangroves are even better than eelgrass at sequestering carbon, but regardless to say, seagrasses are incredibly important for that function. And then they also do stuff like trapping sediments because of their root systems, which can help reduce shoreline erosion for any sort of waterfront properties. And the seagrass can kind of attenuate wave energy a little bit, but that function is maybe less so than mangroves and kelp forests. But overall, the cumulative impact or value of these plants means that it's been estimated in the Salish Sea that 1 hectare provides $87,000 worth of ecosystem services per year. That's really incredible. And you can find more about this. Is another graphic from the Ocean Watch report. So please visit oceanwatch.ca to learn more. So I've talked about the value of eelgrass. Now, what's the conservation story here? This plant likes to grow in calmer and quieter bays. It doesn't like super wavy exposed shorelines. So these bays, unfortunately, are also where humans like to anchor, and we like to have the safer, quieter place to moor our boats and to build our docks and to swim and to recreate and explore. So there's quite a lot of overlap between where eelgrass grows and where humans like to develop, which means that seagrasses are one of the most threatened marine habitat. They've declined by 35% over the past few decades, and that's really not great because of all of the services that they provide. In some bays in the States and elsewhere in the world, eelgrass has just completely vanished because of the impacts of human activities. So we have this photo here that kind of visualizes that a little bit more clearly. On our left, we have a bay with a lot of boats in it, all of these little white dots. And these boats are attached to traditional mooring buoys, which have a buoy and then a chain that connects to a block on the seafloor. And when the tide goes up and down, that buoy moves around and it kind of pulls the chain with it, and the chain just rips apart everything on the seafloor and forms these halos where nothing can grow. So the dark part is the seagrass, and the halo is where the seagrass can't grow because of the scouring from that mooring chain, which isn't great because eelgrass is not able to perform the functions that we value if it's so fragmented. We want to maintain the connectivity of this habitat, just like a forest, right? If you have a forest that had 10 trees, and you removed 6 of them, those 4 trees are a lot more vulnerable to storms, and they're not going to provide the habitat that all of the other species need. But thankfully, we have a lot of ways that we can avoid this. First of all, we can anchor outside of the depth of eelgrass, which in the Salish Sea is around 7 meters chart datum. So if you're a boater, try to anchor deeper than that depth. Or if there's no safe anchorage deeper than that or outside of the eelgrass bed, then you can install what we call an environmentally friendly mooring buoy design, which has a midline float that lifts up the chain from the seafloor, and often these use rope rather than chain, and means that all of that tugging action as the buoy moves around happens in the water column rather than on the seafloor. And this past fall, I was really excited to be a part of a project where we installed one of these midline floats in a bay on Bowen Island. And so that's a neat opportunity to kind of monitor the eelgrass around that and really ensure that we have the data to provide the confidence in the design of these environmentally friendly mooring buoys. Another design is this helical anchor, which is twisted into the sediment and essentially means that there's a much smaller footprint of the mooring block rather than a traditional like huge cement block. And I was really happy to learn this week, I was on a call with folks in the Puget Sound in Washington, that the Washington State Department, I think, or Department of Ecology, essentially like any mooring buoys that are permitted there have to use this helical anchor now. That's like the baseline. You have to apply to use a different type. So BC can learn from a lot of the things that Washington's doing to protect their coastline. Getting back to the research, in 2017, when the Howe Sound Ocean Watch report came out, they identified that we knew at the time where eelgrass lived around the islands in the Sound because a couple groups had surveyed the distribution of that plant, but we didn't really know that much about where it was growing along the mainland of the shore. That was a big data gap because nobody had done that survey. So last year, I got to do some field work with these lovely ladies from Oceanwise and a few people from Moonstone Consulting on the Sunshine Coast, and we surveyed the distribution of eelgrass along the whole mainland of the Sound to fill that knowledge gap through as a part of the Marine Reference Guide project. And that was super neat because, yeah, it's just awesome to get out into the field and learn about this plant hands-on rather than just looking at maps and pictures, even though that's fun too. But the best part about this work is that it has already led to policy and management change. So in Gibsons, which is on the western part of the Sound, in the mainland, this map on our right shows the distribution that we mapped, and the different colors are for the surveys that have happened in different years. So the pink is for the 2019 survey, and in 2013 and 2004, those are the other two colors. And this time series kind of gives us an insight into how the eelgrass is growing or declining in the region, and has led to the town of Gibsons bringing this data into informing their revisions of their harbor management plan, and hopefully in the designation of some eelgrass protection zones. So that's super exciting for me as a researcher to be involved in work that is already translating to change is just like the best. And the other work that's happening in this region is restoration. So with SeaChange Marine Conservation Society, we've been doing a project over the past few years to conduct eelgrass restorations in the Sound and work with communities to identify the sites. That's been a really neat process for me because in the past, SeaChange used to just look at ecological data for where eelgrass was or wasn't and where there's forage fish and kind of pick their sites based on that. But they've revised their approach now, and they involve a lot more community engagement to work with people so that we can understand what the history of the bay is, what the human activity in the bay is. And that's really critical because communities at the end of the day are going to be the people who are responsible for monitoring the activities in the bay and ensuring that people who use the waterfront are respectful of the marine life that lives underground. So that's a neat process. And this picture was taken on Bowen Island in 2019. So far we've done 5, 6, 7 eelgrass transplants in the Sound. We've also done a couple subtidal debris removals where you pull up all of the garbage that people used to dump and still sometimes do in the ocean in order to free up that habitat space for marine plants to grow. And then next up for our projects, we're doing a plankton survey this year to fill in that data gap because nobody's surveyed plankton in the Sound since the 1970s. And we're also working with community members to do some participatory mapping, which is when you sit down with somebody who really has a good understanding of the area and you document their knowledge. And that's really important because that way we can bring in local knowledge holders and convert their data into a format that can be compared with all of these other types of data and used to inform marine planning and management of regions. And that's a good way of ensuring that planning processes, which can traditionally be quite top-down and government-led, have integrate and incorporate the voices and the values and the knowledge of community members who live in that area. So that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. And I guess my main take-homes are essentially that I've learned over the past few years that a strong connection to place can really inspire and foster stewardship and community-led actions. And there's nowhere better to look, in my opinion, than Howe Sound for evidence of that. All of the initiatives that are happening here are drawn from people's love for the region and people's really intense connection to taking care of and monitoring and ensuring that we can protect and change our behavior to foster a healthy ocean, but also the important reminder of the need to remain vigilant with connecting our research and knowledge to the people who can mobilize it, rather than just, as I mentioned at the beginning, continuing to generate information and not really ensuring that it's going to the people who need to use it. So those are two take-homes that I hope resonate with you all. Also, this work is just immensely collaborative. There's no way that anybody can do this by themselves. And I want to extend my huge gratitude towards all of the groups and governments and foundations and individuals and institutions and organizations on this slide, because it takes a village to do this work. And it's wonderful to have the support of local governments in this region and to have the collaboration across a ton of different nonprofits and the support of foundations. So yeah, collaboration is at the heart of it. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time tonight. Here are a few of the website links to the groups that I talked about today. We have the Marine Reference Guides website, the Ocean Watch Report, HowSoundConservation.ca, which is that interactive map. And then this is the Howe Sound Biosphere Region Initiative, which is, I can talk if anybody has questions about that afterwards. And then if you're on Twitter, you can find me there or on my website. So thank you very much. And that is all I have.